And then now that we're recording, we let us begin. And let us begin with prayer. Loving God, on this snowy night, we pray for those who find themselves caught in the storm, for those who find themselves isolated, and for those who may or may not have power. We pray that in our learning tonight, as we pull back the curtain, that we may have a new understanding of what the core message of Revelation is. Be with us in our conversations tonight, in our questions that we bring, in whatever trepidation that we might have, to see the message of hope and to hear it in a new way. So we pray that you would be with us tonight, surround us with your love and your grace, we pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right. And so with that, we begin. So this week is pulling back the curtain. And if anything, this is if there was one session to understand what the core message of Revelation is about, this is actually the session that you would want to catch. Mostly because all of the bizarre imagery, all of the symbolism itself is driving towards this kind of central point in terms of what Revelation is, in terms of the formal pulling back of the curtain. It's not necessarily the core message, but it's the main look. So just as a reminder of where we've been, of course, we're going to be incorporating a lot of the material that we've worked with so far into tonight's discussion. Specifically, we get into a little bit more depth of looking at the numbers and the symbols, specifically within chapter 12 through 15. And so when we okay, here comes Sue. And here comes Ron. So well, take a little bit of a pause as they come in. So here's Sue connecting with audio. Ron, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I was a little concerned that the power was flickering before. It has been flickering here off and on. So if I suddenly go dark, we'll try and get back.
I've had the same thing happening here, John.
Yeah. So and if all of a sudden just somebody else drops out, I won't take it personally. But anyway, here we are, just on our way in, just in terms of where we've been, and of course, probably one of the most bizarre ones, and one that I will fully admit, last week's seals, trumpets, and bowls set was probably for me one of the most difficult lessons to work through, just because there's so much imagery, there's so many different layers, and there's always this want to kind of nitpick apart each piece of that, and yet the imagery is so dense that it's kind of hard to work through. Now I am going to cover it on a recap, but today, as I was saying before, this is, if anything, this is the core message of Revelation, and some of the literary brilliance of it is part of the conversation today. So we'll get into that in a second, and then next week we actually deal with the working the latter parts of the book, really from chapters roughly 17 on through to the end of the book. And in that sense, it's about that vision of ultimate hope. But the thing is, it's fine to say, well, it is a vision of ultimate hope, but in part, as if like this week, it's what is the hope from, or what is the hope about? And that's what today's is, but this is leading into it. So, and then once we're done that, once we've covered all the book in really what's been an overview, we then come back to the question of what is a responsible way to use and interpret Revelation in the 21st century. And that's on December 13th. Notice I actually fixed the date this week. So the last several times that's been saying November 13th, and that's been wrong. So I'm just going to do a little recap. As I said before, probably of all the sessions that I was least comfortable with was last week, but these are a couple of points moving in, not just from last week, but also from previous points in the seminar, as to a reminder that when we get into these symbols, we're not covering all the bases. This is largely, it's an overview. We've largely been in kind of an orbital level. This time we actually get down to maybe, a plane. Sometimes we might be able to get a pass over a mountain or something like that to get a slightly better view. So one of the things to understand with Revelation is that the symbols in the book are very nuanced. They're much more than an allegory. There may be some allegorical elements to it, but they're more than that. And so there's a lot of different interplay that we can kind of touch on. I'm just kind of hoping that we might be able to give you a better sense of it. The numbers themselves are not literal. Again, they are symbolic. So the number 3 in relation to something symbolic of heavenly matters, 4 earthly matters. And then when you have numbers like 7 and 12, you either get 3 plus 4 or 3 times 4 for those broad ones. And then other numbers like 40, for example, it is a representative of a long period of time and it's a reference to something that is used in the Old Testament quite a bit. Wandering for 40 years in the desert, 40 days and 40 nights, that Jesus going out into the desert for 40 days, those kinds of things. That's what 40 is also symbolic of. And then, of course, there's also the language structure itself, which is not something that we normally pick up all that well, because one, we're not reading Revelation in its original Greek. We are reading it through the filter of whoever happened to translate it, whatever translation you happen to be using. And so in that sense, it's also the physical structure, like the actual word structure of Revelation that is also having an impact. Now, for last and also we tend to speak in pictorial language. That's what I'm using right now, or trying to. Whereas Revelation uses I'm trying to do this with propositional language mostly. Revelation is pictorial language, and so we have these things about how these certain elements about the language, how the language behaves. And so symbols in propositional language versus symbols in this kind of thing, and also you're dealing with a language and a form of writing that is intentionally not logical, in terms of, it's not a well-reasoned argument that's happening here. It's evoking emotion. Time is also a different, works in a different way. And the idea is that it uses stories, foundational stories, myths, to convey truth, as opposed to myth. Myth is bad, truth is good. In this particular case, what you actually have is these evocative stories intending to convey convey truth. Not something that we it's not where our brains inhabit. So, and of course, a reminder, we are, the whole point of what we're dealing with tonight is we've gone through this process to get here. And we have the opening of heaven's door, this threefold structure of worship in heaven. And this is important because it'll come back in a sense, that we have the authority of the throne conveyed to the Lamb, the universal worship, the opening of the seals, then eventually the trumpets, and there's these bowls of incense kind of waiting in the wings, and but in this, all of creation is worshiping God. And the idea is that it sets that stage for us. Also, as we're on our way in, we have, as the seals are being opened and all of these different symbols, but there are parallels across the symbols. You know, they're not direct correlations. They're almost like three different views of 7 different sequences. But the sequences are overlaid, so we get this kind of heavenly view. So the fact that there are three groups of 7 is also relevant in how everything is mentioned. And I think I made somewhat of a crack last week that usually one of the reasons why the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse usually ends up as part of as an image that is frequently brought up outside of Revelation is because usually you might get into those first 4 seals and then just you lose the plot, and so because they're the first 4 things that set up. But the phrase 4 horsemen of the apocalypse does not appear anywhere in Revelation. You just have these riders that come in, as far as those images are concerned. And the seals and the trumpets lead into chapter 12 to 15, and then you have in chapter 16 the bowls of incense as they are poured out, cycling us out. I get to that in a little bit more, but these are kind of like the brackets around what we're getting into. All right. Realize that, okay, I've just kind of said, okay, here's a reminder of all this stuff, and you know, it's kind of like I'm trying to pour a bucket of water on you. Hopefully you're a little wet. But really what we're dealing with here, you know, think of course, how many of you, and how old were you when you saw The Wizard of Oz?
Yeah.
So, yes.
9, 10.
Never mind that man behind the curtain, or don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain when they confront the great and powerful Oz the second time, not the first time, and Toto goes over and pulls that curtain back, and you see that, and you actually see the man, the wizard, behind the curtain, you know, pumping all the gears and making all the sounds and everything else. Essentially, what we have here is it's Toto pulling back the curtain. But what's behind the curtain is a little weirder. It's not just something, oh, that's plain and ordinary. So what we have here is, this is the core of Revelation's message. It is separate from, like, we have the seals, the trumpets, and then we have this. And the seals and the trumpets are basically 2 laps through this cosmic view of what's happening. And in the process, you have the seals being broken and opened, and broken and opened, and trumpets sounding. In essence, it's drawing us into, you know, it's revealing what's on the scrolls, it's announcing, and then it brings us into this glimpse of the cosmic cycle. And then on the other end of it, the bowls take a sort of cycle us back out. If any, so you have this kind of cycle from the beginning of the 7 letters to the 7 churches, gathering everybody up. All right, let's take a visit to into heaven, into this image of divine worship. Through divine worship, we then have the Lamb opening these seals. Then we have the angels announcing, and then it's kind of like, okay, that was all pre-show. This is where the curtains come back and open up. And so, as I said, if there is a core message to Revelation, it's really chapters 12 through 14, and kind of 15 begins to transition us back out. So one of the things that Revelation does, and it uses masterfully, it uses images that people of the day would have known implicitly. But it doesn't just stick with one genre. It actually pulls in a whole bunch of them. And that's where it's kind of like you almost have it, even if you pull out a scorecard, it's like, okay, you're kind of checking this stuff off here, but then you got to go to, well, there's other stuff over here and other stuff over here. And hopefully you'll see why in a moment. But the idea is that, I'm intentionally using this background, I like using this background anyway, but it's even more so that this is the cosmic panoramic view to expose the real targets of God's judgment and wrath. Because Revelation, it kind of has that reputation of being, God's judgment. And the trouble is, we tend to understand God's judgment in a very negative light. Curiously enough, in Hebrew, the word that is translated forward into judgment literally means to make right. It does not mean condemnation. It means to make right. The trouble is then again, over time, we tend to pull things in different understandings. We tend to view the word judge, like, in our society, being in front of a judge is not a place you want to be. Even in a civil trial, you really don't want to be there. Whereas in this case, it's about making things right. And I've used the phrase last week about talking about the violent imagery. One a fairly common theme in wisdom literature, as well as even Paul uses this metaphor, especially in his letter to the Romans, is talking about birth pangs, the pain of birth, that ultimately, yes, going through the process of giving birth to a child is difficult and painful and sometimes dangerous, but ultimately you end up with something beautiful, or hope to. But it is not without risk, and that's this birth pangs of moving to something new. That's what that sense of judgment, of making things right. Wrath, on the other hand, well, that let's kind of we'll get to it, and hopefully you'll see why. And the trouble is, we tend to when reading things like this, is we tend to point towards other things. That's and the one mistake, if anything, that we can take, that we might take from Revelation, is that it gives us license to condemn other people. And that's not what Revelation ever intended. I think John of Patmos would be horrified. Like specific people, but on the other hand, systems and structures, absolutely. And that's what we'll get into that. So and I've used this metaphor before, is that one way to understand Revelation is to use is that it's a verbal equivalent of a modern day political cartoon. And given that we just that we've just come out of Grey Cup season, thought this one might be appropriate. And, this has no biblical equivalent of it. It's just a statement that the Grey Cup weekend often gives Canadians license to drink. So there's one. I have another one from a few years ago about the post-Thanksgiving election in Ontario that leftover joke about leftover turkeys. Generally, if you go in and look at political cartoons uses symbols that you already know what those things are. And so when looking, we know what the symbols are. I've described it last week. Generally, if you see a political cartoon that's relevant to the United States, especially, if you see a donkey and an elephant present, that's talking about the two-party system that they in the United States. He usually uses those as metaphors, as symbols to offer some sort of observation about that kind of thing. We have our Canadian equivalents as well, but of course we have that context. We are part of Canadian culture. We live very close to the United States. We are already familiar with what those symbols are. Reading Revelation is like looking at a political cartoon and having no idea what that actually is at all. So what we want to do is we want to take a look at in chapter 12, and we have chapter 12 opens up with the woman and the dragon. Just want to sorry, most of my and so I'm just going to bring up chapter 12. And there's the story of the woman and the dragon opens up like this. A great portent appeared in the heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pangs and agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in the heavens, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on its heads. His tail swept down on 1/3 of the stars in the heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that she can be nourished for 1,260 days. Okay, so how many of you got any of that imagery? I'm not seeing any hands, and I'm not expecting you to. Hi, Richard. All right. And Ron, you've got your hand up.
I do. John, I've just been thinking as you've been talking, would it make it easier for us in general to understand Revelation if it were somehow rewritten using what are contemporary symbols for us?
The short answer is yes. It probably could. It would resemble, but the thing is, a lot of it's very contextual. It might resemble something like the film that came out a number of years ago that I mentioned, Ready Player One, because like we tend we're a much more visual culture. And so watch it, and if you've ever like some of you attempted to watch Ready Player One, and it like you might have gotten 20 minutes into it, and the trouble is Ready Player One is highly contextual. It means that unless you were a teenager in the 1980s, you know, a lot of the symbols will go right over your head. But on the other hand, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I don't think were you here for that when I mentioned Don McLean's American Pie?
Yes, I was.
Okay, yeah. So, but would it be useful? It may be. Can we do it? Someone who is a lot more scholarly than I it probably would need their skill level. Because part of it's trying to find examples. So let's kind of get into The Woman and the Dragon, because this one, you know, it sounds odd. I mean, I just read this to you, and how many of you it sort of sounds like the birth of Jesus.
I've
You know,
heard that.
yeah, some of you picked up there up, but there's other pieces in there that just seem so out of place. It's like, okay, well, what is that? Here's the interesting thing, is that to anybody listening to this, and listening, not reading, listening to this, because it was intended to be heard, would have known very well this image in Greco-Roman society. And they would also pick up on the multiple levels of storytelling at play. It would actually be it is, because it's drawn from a story that is so well known, people would know it and pick up on it, regardless of whether they were you know, if their faith if they were part of Greco-Roman society, and understanding the different stories that people would be exposed to. So let me how many of you have any sort of understanding of Greek mythology? Okay. A little bit. Well, how many of you have heard of a Greek god by the name of Apollo?
Yeah.
Okay, this one, okay, chances are you've heard of Apollo. Mostly, if for nothing else, it is the name of the space program that took people to the moon right around the time that I was born. And so what we have is, if you look up the story of the birth of Apollo, you'll start to see things that are familiar. So just as a bit of a background for those of you who may not be known, or a little bit of a refresher, Apollo is the son of Zeus and Leto. Zeus is well known for not exactly being faithful to Hera. And so Hera, every time Zeus goes off and does some sort of dalliance, she doesn't take it out on Zeus. She takes it out on the child, or the mother of the child that Zeus fathers. And in this particular, you know, I mean, there's more than one of this. I mean, Perseus is another one there, like, and there's all sorts of different variations on that. But in her anger, Hera sends the dragon Python. That's where we actually get the name Python from, you know, because we think snake, but Python, the dragon, to pursue the mother and to devour the child. And she finds, like it seems to be a done deal. Like child is gonna, like mother's gonna die, child's gonna die, and she finds refuge on the island of Delos, and there Apollo is born. And Apollo then apparently quickly matures and hunts down Python and slays the dragon. I'm not sure how these age things work, but that's part of the, you know, and this is a précis of the story, but that the dragon pursued the mother, mother gives birth to Apollo then turns around and hunts down hunts down Python and slays the dragon. Okay, fine. But part of it is Apollo was also seen as this primeval, almost prototypical king who, in the destruction, in the slaying of the dragon, brings in a golden age of peace and prosperity. Okay. One of the things that you may not be aware of is that Roman emperors and Roman leaders especially wanted to associate themselves with Apollo, with the story of Apollo for political gain. Okay, so that they would associate themselves with that. Now, Roman emperors also eventually wanted to be seen as divine as well, and some of that was also at play. But at very least, it's that they wanted to be seen as inheritors of Apollo's protection and slaying of that great dragon, and the one who defeats darkness and presides over a golden age of empire. So there's that, the presence of Apollo. Now, at this point, some of you are going, what? Okay, what? This is about Revelation. Why are we talking about Greek mythology here? Bear with me. So one of the things is that anybody listening to this would know the Apollo myth. That would be like, as they're listening to this story, they would hear the echoes of the Apollo myth as they're listening to it automatically. Even when you're even in a culture that is largely illiterate, they would know these stories. And so what John of Patmos does is that throughout chapter 12 to 14, he uses this familiar story of Apollo to first evoke its traditional understanding, and then it recasts the players, and in so doing, exposes them for who they are. And I'm going to show you how he does that. So let's deal with some of the symbols. The woman. All right. Now, the woman is not named, but the echoes of Leto, but to a certain degree, also Mary is there, because it also evokes images from the Bible. Of course, we have the birth of Jesus and the Herod's slaughter of the innocents as told in Matthew's gospel. Now, believe it or not, this one is actually not as concrete a connection as you might think, because by the time that Revelation was written, the Gospel of Matthew may have only have just been written, so it hadn't really entered into the cultural collective yet. The more likely biblical image that John of Patmos is drawing on is actually the birth of Moses, because in the slaughter of the innocents, in the story of the Magi from the east coming to visit the baby Jesus and their flight into Egypt, has parallels to the story of the birth of Moses as well. So you have sort of these two as play, but also because one of Revelation is actually very dependent upon the images from Exodus, which, a lot of the really weird stuff from Revelation draws a lot of its parallels of evoking images from the various plagues of Egypt, for example, that ultimately lead to the deliverance of the Hebrews out of slavery, and so that parallel and that evocation is deliberate. So there's that, and then also what happens here is John pulls that sun imagery away from its traditional Roman understanding, that recasts it in using some biblical imagery, and also brings in what scholars call messianic language, that has been that certainly led to the understanding of Jesus, but also was present in a lot of the prophetic works, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, like Isaiah and Ezekiel in particular, but also the Jeremiah as well.
Now.
So Shall I mute you, Brad?
Yes.
So, all right. So let's now talk about the dragon. Okay. And again, keep in mind, these are all metaphors. And so what we have is the dragon is more than a simple association with Python, but Python would be, for people listening to it, especially ones that weren't sort of as knowledgeable about the Christian stories, they would definitely hear that and think Python. But in addition to that, there is also another layer. There's a dragon in Babylonian mythology, Tiamat, and it gets better. So just bear with me with this. I mean, but in the Babylonian mythology, Tiamat is the great dragon of the deep, the embodiment of chaos. We're not talking just kind of a reptilian thing that can breathe fire. We're talking about a being that is effectively the essence of the primordial chaos. And in Babylonian mythology, Marduk, also a sun god, parallel to Apollo, slays Tiamat, divides her body, and forms the sky and the sea from the dragon's remains. And some of you might remember that when I did the Genesis study earlier this year, that this particular story also came back up. And then this image of the war in heaven with Michael and the angels versus the dragon also evokes the Babylonian and Near Eastern stories of this of Marduk and the other gods of the Babylonian pantheon taking on Tiamat. So there's that. No, but there's more to this. But there are also biblical images. On top of that, we also have in Genesis chapter 1, did you know that when the Spirit of God is over the face of the waters, the great deep, the word in Hebrew is tehomot. Linguistically, it's almost identical to Tiamat. Because these are both Semitic languages, and tehomot, Tiamat, same sort of thing. But there, in addition to that, you also have Leviathan. The great creature or creatures of the deep. And then you also have dragon imagery present in Job, Isaiah, Ezekiel, as well, and in Daniel as well. There's particularly the apocryphal parts of Daniel that John of Patmos would have had access to. But the trouble is that how many of you have heard of something called Bel and the Dragon? Okay. If you happen to pick up a Bible that has an apocrypha in it, or it is a Roman Catholic Bible, Bel and the Dragon is effectively an additional chapter to Daniel. You will, if you're reading a Bible that says it has an apocrypha, sometimes it's actually titled as Bel and the Dragon, but it's considered to be sort of an addendum to Daniel. So even in the apocryphal version of Daniel, which at the time, and this would have been in the Greek version of the Old Testament, which John of Patmos had access to, there would also be that. So, but we're still sticking. So and the thing is, John is just evoking all of these different images of the dragon, whether it's Python, whether it's Tiamat or Tehomot, as well as the dragon from Daniel. And then John actually comes out and specifically identifies the dragon as being that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. Identifies the dragon as being symbolically the equivalent, basically that the dragon itself is basically, this is as close to drawing, like stopping for a moment and saying that's what this symbol means. Okay, that's as close as he gets. And at this point in time, up until this point in the Old Testament, like how many of you were raised to understand that the serpent present in Genesis chapter 3 is the devil? Okay. You should most of you probably, I mean, that was certainly conveyed that way. Curiously enough, when Genesis chapter 3 was written, it was never intended that way. It was framed that this is the craftiest of all of God's creatures that God had made, not the devil at all. But thanks to Revelation chapter 12 verse 9 is the first time that parallel, that link was made of identifying the serpent present in Genesis chapter 3 with the devil. And so you get all this kind of serpent imagery present here. But the thing is, curiously enough, this isn't surprising. A dragon is a fearsome creature. Associating it with something that is effectively satanic is not unexpected. Okay, like that's clearly the lineup and the setup for this, because even though all this time is being spent identifying the dragon as the main bad guy in this, that's actually not surprising at all. Because ultimately the dragon gets, in all of these stories, the dragon gets slain, whether it's by Marduk, whether it's by Apollo, whether it's God calming the waters, any of all these. That's not the surprising part. What actually happens is that it's a setup. It identifies the dragon as being the devil, the embodiment of the embodiment of evil and chaos, several times over. But all it's doing here is, this is like the golf ball being put on the tee. This is not the shot. This is just the tee being there. And so when John of Patmos lines up for the swing, this is what happens. What happens is identifying the beasts. And what we actually have is, along with the dragon, this embodiment of evil, you have the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth, and it creates this evil trinity as part of it. Now, at this point in time, the doctrine of the Trinity, as we understand it today, was still in its infancy in early Christianity. But the parallels are kind of hard to ignore. Like it was starting to form, and this became almost like an evil version of it. And so, in addition to that, we also have, I mentioned Leviathan before, and in Jewish tradition, the sea monster and a land monster, namely Leviathan and Behemoth. And some of it is drawn from real world images, like Leviathan would be what people would have seen and called whales. Behemoth, if anybody's ever seen an elephant, most people in and around this time may or may not have seen them, but elephants were certainly present. I mean, Hannibal used them. But these large, very, very large land animals, whether it was a rhinoceros or the like. But now also you have in these Jewish traditions the Leviathan and Behemoth. And notice the books that I have quoted here are probably the ones you're not familiar with, because chances are they're not in your version of the Bible. And yet these are, keep in mind, when John of Patmos was putting together, he wasn't saying, "Does this a Protestant Bible?" Because Protestantism didn't exist at the time. Is this a Roman Catholic? Well, Roman Catholicism, as we know it today, didn't exist at the time. It was just the early church, and they had a Greek translation of the Old Testament, of which Baruch and Esdras especially were present in, and Enoch, depending upon what faith tradition you were part of. If you were Enoch, in some quarters, was considered to be a canonical book in early Christianity, and Oriental Orthodox, I believe Coptic traditions, Enoch is still considered to be a canonical part of the Old Testament. So it depends on what tradition you're part of, but in those passages is where you find some more things about Leviathan and Behemoth. So let's talk a bit about the beast from the sea. Anytime you see in Revelation these beasts, what you have is these are composite images of several different things being brought together and kind of placed together on one creature that is mentally hard to picture. And so what it does do is the beast from the sea recalls the images of the Leviathan, and we have, Job, Psalms, Isaiah, but also the passages that I also mentioned on the previous slide. But it also recalls Daniel chapter 7, talking about the beast from the sea, and it's this combination of a leopard, bear, lion combined together into a terrible fourth beast. At this point in time, people would have heard this and understood it to be emblematic or symbolic of the Roman Empire. But it's definitely cast in a much darker light, because the elements of animals were often like when people would experience the Roman legions, especially in the outlying areas, that they would experience the Roman legions. Some would wear leopard skins as uniform decorations, or bear pelts, or lions, because the Roman Empire had that kind of wide range, and these are beasts that they would not normally see. But so therefore, it was the beast from the sea was commonly understood, would have been understood as the Roman Empire, but there's a little bit more to that. Because when the beast comes out of the sea, it's got a number of heads, and seems to have suffered a mortal wound and yet healed. There's a little bit of a tip, a little bit of a clue. Well, here's an interesting little tidbit of history. This is the first reference specifically to Emperor Nero, and it makes it explicitly clear at the end of chapter 13. But this is the first little hint that it's towards Nero. Without getting into the long sordid history of Emperor Nero, or all the crazy emperors that the Roman Empire had, particularly in the first century, Nero, when he fell out of favor, fled, and he was reported to have died by suicide, by stabbing himself in the knife, or stabbing himself in the neck, or slitting his own throat. And now there's a little bit more about that. Apparently, he ordered one of his servants to do it first to show him how it was done. But ultimately he did. He attempted it. Like, I think he started to carry it out. He may have needed some assistance, but he still considered to have been, killed himself by some sort of neck injury. However, because it was done in private in a condominium, like he had fled and he was somewhere else, he was effectively hiding out in a condo someplace, many people believe that he was still alive, because there were a lot of different rumors that, in fact, that he chickened out, that he didn't actually take his own life, and that there were some that believed that he still lived, and then he would return and reclaim his empire. And so there's that whole thing. I mean, how many people were reported to have seen Elvis after he died? The parallels do exist. And so there were many rumors that you think internet memes are a new thing. Not at all. Rumors and things like that. There were that's Nero all over again. And over the next 20 years, I mean, there kept coming this this rumor and this cycle that Nero was coming back. And so from the point of view of a new emperor comes to power in Rome, but in Asia Minor, I mean, that is like there's the Aegean Sea, Greece, I believe it's the Adriatic Sea, and then Italy, and then Rome is on the other side of that. That's a long way away. And at a distance, people perceive Domitian as basically being, this in fact is Nero come back. So there's this perception here. But in addition to that, that stabbing in the neck and the coming back is also a parody of Christ's death and resurrection. Effectively a blasphemous parody of the death and resurrection of Christ. And so now what we have is, if we now understand the dragon being symbolic explicitly as the devil, or the great cosmic power of evil, and a parody of God, the beast from the sea is a parody of Christ. And in this case, they're inferior, incomplete, and therefore they have to conquer by force rather than by love. So important to remember. So that's the beast from the sea. Now let's talk about the beast from the earth. Likewise, with all the symbols in Revelation, it's a composite. It doesn't mean one direct thing, but there's a whole bunch of images at play being pulled in and put together. And a phrase that is sometimes used is a mashup. That these composites are in fact mashups of several different stories and images kind of put into one thing. Again, in the same way that the beast from the sea evokes the imagery of Leviathan evokes imagery of the beast from the sea, the beast of the land, Behemoth. And again, you have the scripture references there. And what you have is this granted authority from the beast of the sea. That their authority derives from the beast from the sea. Well, we've already established that the beast from the sea is a metaphor for the Roman Empire and its emperor. But this, and so what you have is this line of power from dragon, the embodiment of evil, confers power to the beast of the sea, who then confers power to the beast of the earth. And so that line is clear. That line of evil is clearly drawn. And what you have here is the beast of the earth is effectively a parody of the Holy Spirit, a false prophet. And it's interesting that it's also a beast of the earth, which is very much kind of grounded, whereas we tend to think of Holy Spirit being much more ephemeral. That's also an intentional inversion. Ever so slightly Gnostic, but John of Patmos is not Gnostic, but there's that element to it. But really what we have here is effectively local authorities who are enforcing local imperial worship. In other words, they're making idols pointing to the first beast, the beast of the sea, that people must worship. They're basically, these are the local Roman authorities who are enforcing effectively the official state religion of the Roman Empire at the time. I'm not sure how this would have come together if Revelation was written after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. But that's more of a week 7 question, by the way. And in here, we also have that infamous mark of the beast. And of course, I did cover that when we talked about numbers in session 2, but let's go back to this. But you also have, there's an economic mark to it, is the face of the emperor was on the coins that they used. Okay. In the same way that the face of our head of state is on the coins we use. At least right now it's Queen Elizabeth. At some point it will be King Charles. Not sure how everybody feels about that. But the thing is, that's a matter of commerce, is that the image of the sovereign is present on money. And that's the same sort of thing. It's that economic mark, but also there's a social mark. There's the religious rituals of commerce. I mean, one of the reasons that there were money changers in the temple in Jerusalem was that everybody used Roman coins, but you couldn't bring an image into God's holy temple. You had to change money to have it into local currencies that didn't have that. That's why the money changers were there. Never mind that they were making a profit on it, and that's why Jesus overturned the tables. But that's a different story. And of course, what we have here, and this is why all of these parallels, as we're bringing in all of this together, that we actually have this pointing to Nero Caesar if we do the math, basically saying this is Nero all over again. And of course we have in this, can everybody see my mouse here? You can see it moving around. So like you have in Hebrew, it's this is the equivalent to the letter N, R. This sometimes is a V, but in this context, it's more of an O sound. And then there's another N at the end of this. Because Nero in Hebrew would have been pronounced Neron. And then K, or the KSR, Caesar. By the way, if you ever want to know where you get the word Kaiser or Tsar or Tsar, this is actually where it comes from, is Caesar. And this is how that name is rendered into Hebrew. And so if you take all those letters, N-R-O-N, K-S-R, because everything's on the consonants, the O, it's a little bit of fudging, but that's a consonant. You get the letters, it actually adds up to 666. Now remember, it is 666, it is not 666. And these letter shapes are Arabic numerals that did not exist, and Arabic numerals as a means of writing numbers, never mind as an alphabet form, didn't exist at the time, or was only in its proto stages, because Arabic script as we know it today it was a development out of Nabatean Aramaic, which was a language parallel to Hebrew. But Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic are all Semitic languages. They all have parallels, but you have these numerical shapes wouldn't come for another few centuries. So, all right. So what we have, David, before we get into this, you are muted.
Thanks, John.
No problem.
Just wondering about the equivalence of those consonants to the numerics. How do they relate?
Well, here, let's go back to that. Just this is kind of popping back to our session 2 and talking about numbers, is that prior to the widespread adoption of Arabic numerals as a universal to to describe numbers. Each language had its own way of handling numbers. I mean, all of you probably learned Roman numerals as you were, and that's a legacy from the dominance of the Roman Empire about using Roman numerals. Well, there was one thing that Arabic numerals had over Roman numerals in terms of doing things, like it was easier to do math with them. They also had zero, which, a symbol that meant nothing, which is not present in Roman numerals. So I'm not sure if this necessarily answers your question, David. So you can follow up with another one. That Greek also had a scheme, a mechanism, and curiously enough, if you do apply the same process in Greek, the number that comes out is not 666 with Nero Caesar, it's 616, but that's because it's spelled differently in Greek. And curiously enough, if you actually happen to look, depending on your translation, it does say that other ancient translations of Revelation identifies that number, instead of being 666, it says it's 616. So
in terms of the characters themselves, like
yes,
the very first one there equal to 50.
Yes.
And then the second one is 200.
Yes.
How do they relate, or how did that work with the Arabs' interpretation of these characters versus numerics?
Well, that is, remember what I said, no such thing as a stupid question, never a bad time to ask it. But the other answer, the third rule to that is I don't know. So that's a question that actually that aside from like I am not as well informed on the development of Arabic numerals, mostly because I'm not a mathematician, and the history of that. So unfortunately, David, I can go look that up. I'll see what I can find out for you, but I can't answer that here. In terms of how was it that a swirl like this ended up being the number 6?
Right. I just asked because a lot of people, when they're fiddling with numbers, and they look at our alphabet, let alone Russian alphabet or Chinese symbols and things like that, that they might use our alphabet to say letter A equals 1, letter B equals 2, etc. Yeah. And so there was just wondering how that came about with these numbers.
Well, I mean, in the case of Hebrew, for example, there is a chart that shows you how those numbers kind of come up. And what happens is, like, you get your kind of tens, and then it jumps up to hundreds, but not just single units of hundreds. So it's hard to say. Brad, you had your hand up.
So in the Arabic numbering system, it was originally based because people really couldn't read. If you think of numbers being generated by an LCD or LED display, right, your 7-segment display, you were counting the internal corners. So a 1 was sort of with the hook on the top and down. So that internal corner was a 1. I'm not too sure how they did 2s and 3s and whatnot, but there is some link in the web that was on about how sort of the internal corners was what you counted up on that. And that also explains why certain letters have the little tails on them.
Yeah, and of course, like Arabic as we know it today is very flowy, but it evolved out of alphabets that were actually much more square. If you look at Nabatean, like Nabatean Aramaic, or the Nabatean script, for example, of which Arabic, as we have it today, sort of developed, is almost like this halfway point between the elegant flowiness of Arabic and the what's referred to as the Imperial Aramaic, or the Syriac block script, which we know as Hebrew, but it was also used for Aramaic. And Nabatean Aramaic was kind of this middle step, and so there may be again, this is something I have to go look up, and it's a rabbit hole that I could dive down. Not sure if I necessarily have time for, but it's interesting of being able to pull that out for you. So anyway, let's continue. So one of the things in evoking the number of the beast, that 666, John is actually pointing back through the entire story from the end of chapter 13 to the beginning of chapter 12. And it's basically like taking an arrow and shooting it through all the way back to the beginning. Because what would happen is Roman emperors associated themselves as that son, that Apollo, being born of the woman who would eventually be the one who would slay the dragon and usher in a golden imperial age as the protector of the empire. That's what the Roman emperors would do. What John does here is he inverts it. He identifies them not as the slayer of the dragon, but as agents of the dragon. It's this wonderful subversive switch where the Roman emperors are casting themselves as basically another version of Apollo, and John of Patmos flips it around and says, no, in fact, they are agents of the dragon, and then identifies the dragon as being the devil. And it is this wonderfully, and it's so subtle how it's done, and then it's just suddenly flipped. And that's the power of that. So that's chapters 12 and 13. So then also in this, not only does John make the point of identifying that the Roman emperor is in fact agents of the cosmic evil, I guess, but not only that the dragon itself has already been defeated, not from a primeval battle in heaven that would indicate, in the case of Babylonian mythology, or even in the Apollo Python myth, but in and through the death and resurrection of Christ. But let's kind of going into the hockey metaphor here, as I've stated here, is that they've already lost. Even as the curtain is pulled back, even as the powers that are revealed, this is who we're dealing with. But guess what? In all of this, they may be in power now, but they've already lost. The game is already over. But that doesn't mean that using the parallel that I've got here, like a hockey team that has lost. It's like, okay, how many injuries can we inflict on the way out? How many of you have watched hockey games like that? Okay. How many, one of the more famous teams was the Philadelphia Flyers during the late 70s or early 80s. They were known as the Broad Street Bullies. And if they couldn't beat you on the ice, they would beat your face. And quite often they would incur more penalties when they knew they were losing, because they figured, well, if we can sustain enough injuries on the other team, that means they'll be weaker when we play them the next time. It's an unfortunate reality, but it was something that did play. But the idea is that so at this point in time, what happens is then once everything is revealed, John then switches into language and words of encouragement. And Revelation chapter 14, verse 12, that we have, here is the call for endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus. Again, now there are evocations from the Old Testament there, drawing some imagery as well. But the idea is that, hey, we've identified who these people, what you're up against, but hang in there, because they've already lost. They just don't know it yet. And then what then begins, what moves then again is that you then have in chapter 15, it then starts cycling back out towards like chapter 15 is very short, and it's the transition between the core revelation from 12 through 14 and and getting ready to move back. But you know what? Here are all what here's pulling back the curtain. Here are all those the powers that you're facing. You're facing down the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire portrays itself as a force for good. It is not, and you need to hang in there, because they have already lost. But now we're going to move into an encouragement, and then what it then does is it cycles out of that vision using the incense in a similar fashion that the seals and the trumpets got us in there. The bowls take us out. It's kind of this cycle, but keep in mind they're all sort of parallels of the same thing. That ultimately prayers of the faithful get answered. And so that's sort of ultimately where that takes us, is that the powers that be, they've already lost. So we're here at about quarter after 8, and so we're just getting ready for this. So so chapter 15 sort of transitions out of that. Chapter 16 is what we covered last week. But again, it's sort of like, think of the seals and the trumpets are like the opening brackets, the core message, and then 15 sort of gets us ready, and then chapter 16 cycles us out of that into the end of the book, and that message of hope. So it's like, here's a little bit of a hint, but we need to cycle back out of this, and then we're going to deal with the message of hope at the end. So I think I jumped back too many slides. So any questions? Because next week, after all of this weird and bizarre imagery, I'm hoping that what we covered tonight makes a little bit more sense of how Revelation works. I mean, is it okay that it's as clear as mud? Yes. Are you going to get absolutely every symbol and nuance? No, I don't. I can't, and I've been studying this for years. But it's just gives you an idea of the pointing out, at least at this point in time, using these symbols right now for something that's very specific and very timely for that. But when we start, not so much next week, but when we talk about this in 2 weeks time, about the exposure of external empire, and Betty, like a couple sessions back, you mentioned that you were watching someone who said that that Revelation was the pointing to the United States in some way, shape, or form. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
As the Great Babylon. That's, yeah.
As Babylon the Great, because like fallen Babylon the Great, which we do deal with next week. Even though the intention, like here, specifically points to the Roman Empire, it also has a broader, like even though it's temporally specific to the Roman Empire, it can be used as cautions against any external empire or anybody or any group that has imperial aspirations. And so while I may not necessarily agree theologically with the person who said that, in some he's not wrong. You know, it's not the full picture, but he's not wrong. And so that's where the images from Revelation, the cautions about empire in specifically the Roman Empire, but empire is in a broader sense. That's one of the things that we'll be talking about in about 2 weeks' time. And so thank you for bringing that up. That I think that's been very helpful on my end. So anyway, so next week we get away from, like, we get some of the weird imagery. We get to deal with the lake of fire next week, which is not one of the pleasant ones, and yet I'm hoping to recast that one so you can understand it a little bit differently. So now what I want you to do is read chapters 17 through 21. Whoops. I didn't intend to lose that one. Let's play that window again. And need to. All right. So read 17 through 21, and the note some of the images again. And one of the things in like I have you go up to the end of chapter 21. You can go up to the end of chapter 22. 22 as a whole, I do reserve for the last session in chapter 7. You can do up to 22, but I'm only going to cover up to the end of chapter 21 because the imagery is both hopeful, but if you're not reading it in the right context, it can be kind of odd and troubling. But at the same time, it also has this image of the new heaven and new earth. Like you actually have chapter 18 is like fallen is Babylon Babylon the Great. You know, we have that image of Babylon that was commonly used as a metaphor for the Roman Empire as well. So you have the Babylonian mythology that's present, and you have this core message of identifying Roman authority as being not beneficial, to put it mildly. So, all right, we're about 20 after 8. I may need to go outside and shovel. I don't know how everybody else's snow situation is. But any questions on anything that we covered anything that we covered today? Like David, I realized you joined us a little late. I did record this. I'll be bringing it back to as a matter no, I won't stop the recording just yet if there's any questions that any of you had. So or anything that any of these slides that you'd like me to go back and review or put back up. By the way, for some of those apocryphal books, anything that I put up there, thanks to the wonders of the internet, you don't have to go out and buy a Bible with an apocrypha in it to find that passage. Just do a Google search and you can find it. You know, so it's out there. It's not locked in some Vatican vault. You know, trying to keep keep some sort of secret from you. That's one of the things that unfortunately Dan Brown and has, I think, done a disservice to us for that. That there's often conspiracy theories are so much more interesting than real life, it seems. But at the same time, we have these things are openly available. I mean, you can go online and literally read the Dead Sea Scrolls. Granted, you would probably need to learn Hebrew or Aramaic to go read them directly, but you can actually look at anything that they found, they've photographed and put up. So it's all there. All right. So I'm just gonna stop the recording. Over here. Just